It's the Talk of the Squad with Isabella, Carmela, and Luke.
Many Western scientists once fully believed that God had created mankind in His own image and likeness until the middle of the 19th century. They thought all the creatures of the planet had been conceived by a divine force, that is until Charles Darwin arrived. Some researchers were already talking about an evolution of the species, but Darwin was the first to explain with evidence how evolution might occur by natural selection. We'll be discussing all about Charles Darwin and his theories of evolution, natural selection, and adaptation.
Wait a minute, who's Charles Darwin? Anyway,
Seriously?
I'm being serious. I've heard his name. I just don't know who he is or what he's done.
Charles Darwin was born in 1809 in England. Darwin was fascinated by the natural world from a young age. He was a British naturalist and biologist known for his theory of evolution and his understanding of the process of natural selection. The boy stood by his overbearing father, whose astute medical observations taught him much about human psychology. Science was then considered dehumanizing in English public schools, and for dabbling in chemistry, Darwin was condemned by his headmaster.
Charles Darwin's theories hugely impacted scientific thought, but his ideas also affected the realms of politics, economics, and literature. The basic idea of biological evolution is that populations and species of organisms change over time. Today, when we think of evolution, we are likely to link this idea with one specific person. It is the British naturalist Charles Darwin. In the 1850s, Darwin wrote an influential and controversial book called On the Origin of Species. In it, he proposed that species evolve and that all living things can trace their descent to a common ancestor. A species is a group of similar organisms that can interbreed with each other to make healthy, fertile offspring. For instance, all human belongs to the same species, which is Homo sapiens.
That's right, at about 500 pages in its original edition, On the Origin of Species, is Charles Darwin magnum opus, and quite possibly the most influential non-fiction book ever written. Darwin's seminal book, On the Origin of Species, set forth his ideas about evolution and natural selection. These ideas were largely based on direct observations from Darwin's travels around the globe. From 1831 to 1836, he was part of a survey expedition carried out by the ship HMS Beagle, which included stops in South America, Australia, and the southern tip of Africa. At each of the expedition stops, Darwin had the opportunity to study and catalog the local plants and animals. During his voyage, in the years after, Darwin developed and refined a set of ideas that could explain the patterns he had observed during his voyage. In his book, On the Origin of Species, Darwin outlined his two key ideas, which are evolution and natural selection.
Now, put on your seatbelts. You're about to go through the highway of evolution.
Evolution is a process by which nature selects from the genetic diversity of a population those traits that would make an individual more likely to survive and reproduce in a continuously changing environment. Over many years and many generations, the full diversity of life on Earth is expressed. Evolution is one of the most fundamental organizing principles of the biological sciences, and such as the single most dominant theme in biology today.
Over the course of his travels, Darwin began to see intriguing patterns in the distribution and features of organisms. We can see some of the most important patterns Darwin noticed in distribution of organisms by looking at his observations of the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador. Darwin found that nearby islands in the Galapagos had similar but non-identical species of finches living on them. Moreover, he noted that each finch species was well suited for its environment and role. For instance, species that ate large seeds tended to have large, tough beaks, while those that ate insects had thin, sharp beaks. Finally, He observed that the finches found on the Galapagos Islands were similar to species on the nearby mainland of Ecuador, but different from those found elsewhere in the world.
From what we can see in the image, modern-day species appear at the top of the chart, while the ancestors from which they arose are shown in the lower chart.
These are the things to remember about evolution. Evolution is not progressive. Evolution is not designed to produce the best quality products. It only seeks to design adaptations that will do the job most efficiently and economically. Therefore, evolution used the mammal template throughout the development of all mammal species, like pentadactyl limbs, mammary glands, spinal curvature, pelvic structure, and made the necessary modifications to suit the niche that species live in. Evolution is not an argument for the status quo. Evolution does not dictate why things are the way they are. It must be remembered that some of an animal's features may be trade-offs or byproducts of the evolution of an unrelated adaptation. Evolution provides constraints, while as gone before sets physical limits on what we can do now. This is seen in the fact that we learn some things much more readily than others. In this sense, evolution has also constrained what things we are able to perceive and attend to. And lastly, evolution provides complexity from simplicity. Species that depend on each other for food, predator-to-prey relationships, often enter into arms races as they try to outdo each other.
Isn't it cool how we actually once looked very different from what we are today?
I mean, I cannot really imagine myself to be living with dinosaurs. That would be scary and cool though, but I'm grateful to have existed during the 21st century. Evolution rocks.
Oh, it surely does. Now, how did we really get to what we are today? The answers lie in Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection.
Natural selection is a process through which populations of living organisms adapt and change. Individuals are naturally variable, which means that we are all different in some ways. This variation means that some individuals have traits better suited to the environment than others. Individuals with adaptive traits have the advantage that they are more likely to survive and reproduce. These individuals then pass the adaptive traits on to their offsprings. Over time, these advantageous traits became more common in the population. Through this process of natural selection, favorable traits are transmitted through generations.
In addition, here's what my 21st century device has provided me. These are some of Darwin's concepts of natural selection that were based on several key observations. Traits are often heritable. In living organisms, many characteristics are inherited or passed from parent to offspring. More offspring are produced than can survive. Organisms are capable of producing more offspring than their environments can support. Thus, there is competition for limited resources in each generation. Offspring vary in their heritable traits. The offspring in any generation will be slightly different from one another in their traits. Color, size, shape, etc., and many of these features will be heritable.
Wow, I often wonder what my ancestors looked like. Sometimes I like to look in the mirror and thank them for giving me this irresistible gift.
I'm just grateful that I exist today, strong and healthy.
We're all grateful for the traits our ancestors gave us, and yes, for our beauty and strength. But how did all of our traits today survive centuries of natural selection?
Adaptation theory, also known as survival theory or survival of the fittest, is an organism's ability to adapt to changes in its environment and adjust accordingly over time. Adaptations occur over generations of a species, with those traits that help an individual animal eat and mate profusely being passed down from generation to generation until the whole species changes to be better suited to their environment.
Wow! It really is survival of the fittest for all of us here, huh?
Yes, and did you know that survival of the fittest actually was a term made famous in the 5th edition on the origin of species by Charles Darwin? Darwin borrowed the term from English sociologist and philosopher Herbert Spencer, who first used it in his 1864 book Principles of Biology. Spencer came up with the phrase only after reading Darwin's work.
Hmm, that's interesting. But Darwin did not consider the process of evolution as the survival of the fittest. He regarded it as the survival of the fitter, because the struggle for existence is relative and thus not absolute. Instead, the winners with respect to species within ecosystems could become losers with a change of circumstances. For example, fossil evidence supports the notion that mammoth was more fit during the most recent ice age, which ended roughly 11,000 years ago, but it became less fit as humans hunted it and the world's climate warmed. Fossil evidence suggests that mammoths succumbed to extinction a few thousand years later.
How intriguing! These days, with climate change still intensifying by the minute, I don't know which species will survive about a few centuries from now. We've already faced the extinction of many animal species throughout the years, from cheetahs to rhinos to frogs, and even the real-life dodos that we loved watching in cartoons as children. Today, more than 150 years after Darwin's theory became known, we know that evolution is a fact. Every day, everything on this planet is changing, and humanity is changing with it.
Today, we learned all about Charles Darwin, his theory of evolution through natural selection and adaptation. We hope you liked the video and that you've learned valuable knowledge from us. This has been the Talk of the Squad with Isabella, Carmela, and Luke.